Okay, you may not have heard of a snapdragon before, but you've definitely heard of blood types before. So, again, to get started, let's put our name on our paper. Alright, so blood types. So there's this fancy vocabulary term here called an agglutinogen. Okay, so you've got these agglutinogen proteins. There are several genes that determine blood type. One of those genes produces agglutinogens, which are antigen proteins. So we've talked about proteins before. These are just proteins that are attached to the surface of red blood cells. There are two different types of agglutinogen proteins. There's a type A and a type B. These agglutinogen proteins are produced by two different alleles of the same gene. So this multiple allele situation, up to last week, we were using a simplified model where there were only two possible alleles, but in reality, real genes often have more than two possible alleles. And that's the case with blood type. Some of you may know your blood types, some of you may not. You might try asking your parents or guardians to see if they know if you don't currently know. It's a good thing to know about yourself. And we're going to talk about one of the reasons why it's a good thing to know, and it has to do with the fact that based on the type of blood you have, it determines what kind of blood you could receive in a donation if you needed to have blood donated to you. So there are actually three different alleles with blood type. There's IA, IB, and little I. So with IA, it produces an A type protein on the red blood cell surface. So you see this little A type protein up here. With IB, it produces a B type protein. On the surface of the red blood cell. And then little I, well, with little I, there's no protein on the surface of the red blood cell. And little I is recessive to both IA and IB. IA and IB, however, are codominant to one another. Now, there's a situation with antibodies. So the human immune system has antibodies that can detect foreign proteins and tell the immune system's white blood cells to attack the foreign proteins or cells. So if a person does not have B proteins on their red blood cells, and they receive a blood transfusion with cells that have B-type proteins, then their anti-B antibodies and their immune system can attack the new blood cells. So let's think about this carefully. It says if the person does not have type B proteins. So who would not have type B proteins? So IA and little I would not produce type B proteins, okay? Now I get that you don't have a space to write that part, but you need to understand that what this is saying here is if the person is type A or if the person is type O, meaning they have little i's only, then they don't have any B protein on the surface of their red blood cells. They don't have this piece up here. And since they don't have it, they have antibodies that would fight against it. The same idea exists with type A. So if a human does not have A proteins, they're going to have anti-A antibodies. So you're going to have the antibodies to anything that you don't have, because anything that you don't have is going to be foreign to your own body. So if you had type A blood, but you were given type B blood, you're going to fight it off because it's foreign to your body. So let's see if we can break this down a little bit better. So type A blood. So let's talk about our genotypes. Well, we know that if a person has both IA and IA, they're obviously going to have type A blood. But we also know that type A is dominant over type O. So if a person has one IA and one little I, then they're going to have type A blood because the type A is dominant over the type O. So what are our alleles involved here? Well, if a person is IA, they obviously have 2 IA alleles. Remember, you need the comma there when we're listing alleles. If a person is IA little I, and they have 1 IA and 1 little I. Now remember, you have antibodies to what you don't have. Well, type O doesn't have any proteins at all, so there's nothing to have an antibody against there. So you're only going to have antibodies against A's or B's. And it's whichever you don't have. So if a person has type A blood, they're going to have anti-B antibodies. So that means they can't receive type B blood or they're going to fight it off. But they could receive type A blood or type O blood. They wouldn't fight off either one of those. So either one of those would be fine to receive. Now, if a person has type B blood, we obviously know that IB would result in type B blood type. We also know that IB is dominant over O, or little I. So, because little I translates to type O blood, okay? So those are our 2 options there for our genotypes, our alleles. Well, it's the same idea here. If it's IB, then they've got 2 IB alleles. If they're IB little I, they have 1 IB allele and 1 little I allele. Okay, so this person has a B protein on the surface of their blood. They do not have an A protein on the surface of their blood. So they are going to have anti-A antibodies, which means they cannot receive type A blood. They're going to fight it off if they do. But they can receive type B or O blood. They wouldn't fight either one of those. Okay, now a person that's AB, well, they have to have 1 IA allele, and they have to have 1 IB allele. That's the only way you can be AB. Now, we put them in alphabetical order, so it doesn't matter which biological parent the A came from and which biological parent the B came from. It's just that they have 1 IA and 1 IB. So the alleles here, pretty straightforward. They have an IA, they have an IB. Now, let's think about this. A person that's AB has both of these proteins on the surface of their red blood cell. They have an A protein and they have a B protein. So, they're not going to have any antibodies. Which is really useful for a person that's type AB blood type, because a person that's type AB, they could receive blood from A, they could receive blood from B, they could receive blood from AB, or they could receive blood from O, because they don't have any antibodies there, so they're not going to fight any of those off. So they could receive any of those. But think about it. They could only give their blood to another person who has AB blood. Because they couldn't give it to somebody that only has A, because that person would fight off the B portion. And they couldn't give it to somebody that only has B, because that person would fight off the A portion. And let's talk about why they couldn't give it to somebody who is type O. So the only way to be type O is if you have two little I alleles. So if you have two little I alleles, you don't have an A or a B on the surface of the red blood cell, which means you have anti-A antibodies and anti-B antibodies. So you can't receive any blood that has any A in it or any B in it. So you can't receive any A, you can't receive any B, you can't receive any AB. Only thing that a person with type O blood can receive is more type O blood. Now, to make this even a little more complicated, and we're not going to go too far in depth here, but there's a little bit more to this. There's also something called the rhesus factor. Now, not like Reese's peanut butter, rhesus as in like the rhesus monkey. There's another factor, and that gene has two alleles. And that allele is either positive or negative. So it's a positive and a negative. And a person who is negative can only receive negative. A person who is positive can receive either one. That Rh factor, the rhesus factor, works in combination with the A, B, and O blood types.